Good morning, class. Uh, Today, what we are going to talk about is behavior ecology. And I'm going to break this up into two different sections, basically talking about the whole idea of nature versus nurture, as well as then the issue of, well, what are all these parts of behavior and how they affect um, the animal or how we measure it. So I put this in ecology because animal behavior is a link between psychology as well as how these animals work together in a group. Because there are some animals that are very good to work in a group, and then there's some that are very solitary. And we do not understand why or how this is automatic for them. So we've had this idea of nature versus nurture, and perhaps you've heard this idea of some things that are pre-programmed into our genetics called nature. And nurture is how we are raised and the way we grow up, influencing how we act. And this doesn't sound as deep of a question until you start thinking, well, how much of how we act as a species and as a person is due to how we are brought up versus how we are genetically programmed to act, such as why do we want to communicate with our voices? Why do we react the way we do to um, aggressive signals versus have we been trained to do that because we know somebody's going to hit us? Things like that. This can give us a lot of insight in how people react and how their behavior is part of their environment. And this behavior modification or behavior ecology study has even been brought down to microbes in your gut. I've talked a little bit about that. But basically, what is a behavior? I mean, a good example of behavior is, well, birds building nests. Some of them build nests in a very, very specific way. A lot of them do. Do they know how to do that, or were they trained how to do that? Moles will work together in a colony to make a tunnel network with a very good ventilation system in order to keep health of the animals. And bees have this very sophisticated communication system of tactile as well as pheromone sense. So how do they know how to do that automatically? Basically, we measure this by behaviors, and basically this is action we can observe. It's fairly straightforward with that, and we're just trying to answer to exactly how much of this is beyond our control versus things that we can actually control. Um, this is even something that is important to answer in the judicial system because people will say, I couldn't help it, it's in my nature. Well, is that true or isn't it? Some mental aspects sometimes are that we've determined, and many times it is more of an excuse for illegal behavior. But there is a lot of generalizations about, oh, they're crazy, they didn't know what they were doing, or um, the opposite argument as well. So we have to be careful with generalizations. A good example, I'm going to go through a couple of examples of nature, and then we'll talk about nurture. A good example of nature is the lovebird, and it is shown here. These are two different species, very closely related, but the lovebirds have a very specific way of making nests. They collect twigs and grasses and even paper and carry it in their beak. And this is the Fisher lovebird, and the peach-faced lovebird will collect materials for making a nest in a different way. It will actually tuck it underneath its feathers in its tail so it can fly that way. So they'll take these strips and tuck them into their tail and then fly that way. Um, and sometimes they'll do one long strip versus short strips. But scientists, when doing making a hybrid, so they bred these two together because they are very close related. That's the only way you can make this work. Hybrids that are half and half will be presented with nest making materials and pick whichever one they want, but then they keep holding in their beak and looking towards their tail feathers in a way that suggests they're trying to figure out, they're getting some kind of mental signal that is kind of reminding them that they should be doing something and they're not quite sure what. This is a measurable, statistically significant fact, and basically it meant like that grad students sat there looking at hours of videos and taking copious amounts of counting notes and how many times the bird looked back versus the two different other types. It sounds like a grad school project, but it isn't conclusive proof, but it starts showing an idea that some of this may be genetic. Garter snakes are a really good example. There's garter snakes and coastal snakes. The coastal snakes tend to run into slugs more, and they eat slugs. The other ones will eat frogs and minnows and stuff like that. But when you take inland snakes and give them slugs, they will not eat them. And one of the ways they also mention or measure if they even identify them as food is by uh, the tongue flicks. Basically, they smell and taste with their tongue. They have something called the Jacobson organ that allows them to sense very small amounts of pheromones and signals for food through their tongue. They'll flick it out and then put it into this organ, and it'll detect very minute traces. So the more tongue flicks means that they're sensing prey around them. Okay, so the coastal varieties will have more tongue flicks due to slugs. And we can show that on the percentage of snakes on the y-axis. That's how many snakes did this specific behavior of tongue flicks, and then how many tongue flicks per minute they had. So if they put slugs out there, the coastal varieties that identify slugs as a meal were flicking out their tongue quite a bit, trying to figure out where that slug was. Whereas the inland varieties did not flick their tongue out as much because they don't really identify that as food. They weren't looking for it as food. However, if you breed these two together, because they are very, very similar, these hybrids will actually eat slugs, and you have this intermediate where they'll have more tongue flicks per minute statistically than the inland slugs. And this one is a little bit stronger evidence because they then later on went on to identify over a number of papers what exactly the difference was and why the hybrids could detect or um, eat these slugs. And it turns out it's all about detection. They had a receptor that was able to recognize the signals the slug was putting off. They got rid of that receptor, and all of a sudden they weren't looking for those slugs or could not detect those slugs, so they didn't eat them. So there was an actual physiological change, genetic, that came out to be a receptor change in the nervous system, so they didn't recognize it as food. So this is a very good example of a nature, a genetic predisposition that caused a behavior change. One that's a little bit more disturbing is the mice rearing. We use mice in a lot of animal assays for what we call in vivo studies, either with infections and spread or just behavior in a number of different areas. You can even do this for neuroanatomy and physiology. So if you are interested in that, you definitely should take some classes with Dr. Slaker in neuroscience, because she ties in this with psychology quite nicely. Now, um, there was, while rearing mice, it was noticed that most female mice take care of their pups and keep them nice and warm and underneath and let them nurse. And this is the natural um, mothering instinct. But they did notice that there was a certain percentage, about 20% of the female mice in this one genetic background, that would push all the pups away and basically not rear them, and they would die. And this was a known phenotype. I even had heard of this with taking care of mice, that certain mice genetic backgrounds were not good at rearing uh, children. I've raised chickens, and you still have the same issue, that some are really good nurturing and brooding hens, or they'll take care of their young very well, and some of them are pretty indifferent. And this can be a big difference in whether or not the mice survive or not. So somebody decided to do an experimental study where they looked at this um, activity, this behavior that they could measure, and then started noticing it was about 20%. Now, those people who are in Bio 202 realized that this could be a genetic behavior, or a sign of a genetic recessive allele, when you're having about 20% of this. And not to give anybody flashbacks, good or bad, to um, um, a Punnett square, but this would suggest that a double recessive could be the activator for this change in behavior. It turns out, long story short, is they linked this back to a single gene called FOSB. And when the three first letters are in italics and lower, this means it's the actual gene. This is a specific gene type in the FOS family. So FOSB, if this was actually produced as a protein, it would be capital letters. But this FOSB gene is important for a specific hypothalamus activation. Hypothalamus, I mentioned already, is a key small organ that has endocrine activity and puts signals directly into the bloodstream for um, um, sexual maturation and actual feelings of emotions even. So it turns out this FOSB gene activates the hypothalamus very specifically and causes a mothering instinct to happen in the mice. If you do not have that FOSB gene and they knock it out, as shown in this graph, how many proportions of pups retrieved, as in if they start wandering out, the mother will bring it back to them to keep them warm and keep them safe. We find that if we knock it out, there is very few mice that would actually retrieve the pups, showing that this gene is very important for that activity. So it turns out this is not only with mice, there is a link with other animals with this, as well as a little bit with humans, although it's a lot more complicated with humans. So do not think because you are not interested in children, it's means that you have this recessive FOSB. It's you are chemically programmed to love your own child. You are chemically programmed to be more annoyed when the child is screaming because it is your own and you want to take care of it. So these things are normal for all parents, and you will love them and think of them as the most brilliant, beautiful children and take care of them over others. You're chemically activated and trained to respond to them specifically. And the more interaction you have early on, the more tight that bond is for men and for women, although it's in different ways. So there's more to this with humans, quite a bit more, but this FOSG product is definitely a strong information that or suggestion that there is a nurture to this argument. Finally, we have this argument for a nurture, and so training by the mother. And this is by measuring something called learning. And unless I am wrong, we will have some learning here. Learning is, by definition, is just a durable change in behavior. That means that you've been trained to identify and do an action that you didn't do before because of it. In very specific ways, sometimes it's with animals just feeding or what have you. Oops, there we go. An example of this is imprinting. Gray gulls will have chicks that tap on the beak to signal they're hungry, and then they get food regurgitated in their mouth. But when they're very young, you can measure their pecks on the beak when they're just born. They know they need to signal somehow, but they don't know where to signal. So this is kind of a mix of nature versus nurture. And the nurturing shows that if you measure all the pecks on a beak, um, they will be all over the place. But over time, even a couple days after, those chicks learn very quickly that they will only get food if they peck right on the beak here. So this demonstrates learning. There is a genetic component that shows that they recognize they have to ask for food. I'll point that out. Now, a very classical association. Well, I'll talk about that next. The other example is singing. Birds born in captivity learn automatically know to sing, but they don't know how to sound like other birds of the same species. So you can measure their wavelengths compared to wild raised birds or the birds born in the wild, and their wave print and amplitude and their whole sound measurement is quite different. However, if zookeepers or people taking care of these born in captivity birds will play birdsong from wild type birds, the birds that were born in captivity will start mimicking them and starting to train their song to sound just like the ones they've heard. So they have this automatic example or automatic want to sing, but they don't know how to sing until they learn how to from other examples. Associative learning is basically learning by linking an activity to a sound or some kind of other activity. A classical example would be Pavlov's dogs. He actually measured the saliva when he rang a dinner bell because he had taught the dogs to that food was coming when he rang the bell. So he did this a number of times over months, and then would just ring the bell and measure how much saliva flow would occur when they rang the bell. So this would be a conditioned response, that the bell would cause the reaction instead of the actual food. Uh, some of us who eat meat, and I'm not trying to pick out those who do, but this is a good example, will smell a barbecue or things cooking on the stove and have their mouth water. I suppose that's the same for cooking food for anybody, really, fresh baked bread or something like that. Now, the interesting kind of intermediate to this there is migration. Now, birds know to migrate, they have a genetic trigger to migrate based on light or temperature or food sources, but it's usually light. And a really good example of this is the European starling, which is not supposed to be in the US, but somebody was crazy enough to bring him over here, and they really destroyed a lot of the songbirds that were naturally here. And they live in large numbers. They're kind of vicious birds. They're kind of fun to watch, but they weren't here naturally. regardless, they breed in northern Europe, and then over winter they travel quite many miles to Wales and England, um, where the winter is buffered by these warm currents. So this makes it somewhat temperate. This is all relative, of course. And some scientists wanted to find out if they automatically knew to fly to England or if they needed to learn by following adult birds. So what they did was kind of a jerk move. They collected birds in Holland and then took adult birds and juvenile birds, tagged them, moved them to Switzerland, and then let them go. And then they waited for amateur bird catchers and observers to report whether or not they saw what tag in these areas. What they found is that the adults said, okay, you guys are jerks. I'm in Switzerland. I'm going to go to where I am supposed to be. Great. So the adults knew how to redirect their travel to get to England, but the juveniles just kept going in the same general direction as they would have to go to England. They just ended up in Spain. So there was a genetic trigger to have them migrate and a general range, but they didn't know where exactly the breeding range was. So unintentionally, the scientists set up a new migratory route to Spain. It shows that there was this association with adults migrating and learning the migratory route from them. Now, I'm going to end it here and then go on to some of the important parts of learning.